There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. You can sleep 8 hours and still wake up tired, because the tiredness was never physical to begin with. It lived somewhere quieter, in the replaying of a conversation that ended hours ago, in the rehearsing of a sentence you will probably never say, in the imagining of futures that haven't happened and may never happen at all. Most people call this just thinking, but there is a moment, usually late at night, when a woman lies still in the dark and realizes that her mind has not stopped moving in years. Not really. It has been running the same quiet marathon since childhood, and she has simply learned to call it normal. What if the problem was never that you think too much, but that you were never taught what to do with what you think? This question matters more than it first appears, because it changes where you look for the solution. Most advice about overthinking tells you to stop, to relax, to let it go, as if the mind were a light switch. But minds don't work like switches. They work like rivers. You cannot command a river to stop moving. You can only understand its current well enough to build something that redirects it without damming it entirely. This is the real difference between people who suffer under the weight of their own thoughts and people who have learned to walk beside them instead of being dragged by them. It is worth being precise about what redirecting actually means here, because it is often misunderstood as suppression wearing a gentler name. Redirecting a river does not mean pretending the water isn't there, forcing it underground, or telling it to be quieter. It means building banks wide enough and strong enough to let the current move without flooding everything around it. In the same way, working with an overactive mind does not mean silencing every anxious thought the moment it appears, or pretending to feel calm when calm is not actually present. It means building enough internal structure, through breath, through boundaries, through practiced presence, that the thoughts can move through without overtaking everything else in their path. The goal was never a mind with no current at all. Even the calmest people alive still think, still worry occasionally, still notice uncertainty. The goal is a mind whose current no longer floods the whole landscape every time it moves. Consider a woman. We can call her Mira, though she could be anyone, because her story repeats itself in millions of quiet variations, who sends a text message to a friend and receives no reply for 6 hours. In that 6 hours, her mind does not simply wait. It builds an entire courtroom. It presents evidence. Did I say something wrong? Was my tone off? Maybe she's upset about last week. Maybe she's pulling away. Maybe I'm too much. By the time the friend replies with a simple sorry, was in a meeting, Mira has already lived through an entire emotional storyline that never existed outside her own mind. She feels relief, yes, but underneath the relief is something else, a quiet fatigue, because she has done this 1,000 times before, and she will likely do it again tomorrow. This is not weakness. It is not a flaw in her character. It is what happens when a nervous system has learned, somewhere along the way, that vigilance is safety. Somewhere in her past, perhaps in a home where moods shifted without warning, perhaps in a relationship where affection had to be earned through constant monitoring, perhaps simply in a culture that has quietly taught women for generations that being liked is a form of survival. Her mind learned that scanning for danger, scanning for disapproval, scanning for the tiniest shift in someone else's tone was not optional, it was necessary. And a mind that has learned this cannot simply be told to relax. It must be shown, patiently and repeatedly, that the danger it is scanning for is no longer there. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that is rarely said plainly enough. This vigilance was, at some point, genuinely adaptive. A child who learns to read a parent's mood before entering a room is not being paranoid. She is being resourceful, using the only tool available to her to navigate an environment she could not control or leave. A woman who learned early that affection could vanish without warning is not irrational for later scanning every relationship for the same warning signs. She is applying a strategy that once kept her emotionally safer than the alternative of not paying attention at all. The tragedy is not that this vigilance existed. The tragedy is that it so rarely gets updated once the original circumstances change. The nervous system, left to its own devices, assumes that what once kept you safe will always be required to keep you safe, and it will keep applying that same old strategy to entirely new, entirely safer environments, unless something actively teaches it otherwise. This is not a personal failing. It is simply how protective systems work when no one ever goes back to recalibrate them. This is the first thing worth understanding. Long before any technique or method, overthinking is rarely about the thing you are thinking about. It is almost always about an old fear wearing a new outfit. There is a particular image worth holding on to here. A smoke detector that has been placed too close to the stove. It goes off constantly, not because there is a fire, but because it cannot tell the difference between smoke from actual danger and steam from a boiling pot of pasta. It is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was built to do, in exactly the wrong context. Most people who overthink are not broken either. Their internal alarm system is simply positioned too close to ordinary life, sounding the same warning for a delayed text message that it once sounded for genuine danger. The work is never to disable the alarm entirely. A person without any warning system at all would be defenseless. The work is to move it further from the stove, to teach it, patiently, what actually deserves its attention and what does not. There is a strange comfort in that realization, even though it doesn't feel comforting at first. Because if overthinking were simply about intelligence or personality or being too sensitive, there would be nothing to do but endure it. But if it is a learned pattern, a nervous system doing what it once had to do to stay safe, then it can also be unlearned, slowly, deliberately, the way any pattern is unlearned, not by force, but by repetition of something new. Consider, for a moment, what it actually costs to live this way, year after year, without ever naming it. A woman who overthinks does not simply spend extra time in her own head. She spends a currency far more valuable than time, attention, the one resource that determines the quality of every relationship, every piece of work, every quiet moment of joy she is supposed to be having. A dinner with friends becomes only half attended, because half of her is still replaying something said an hour earlier. A walk through a park on a beautiful afternoon becomes background scenery to an internal courtroom that never adjourns. This is the quiet tragedy of overthinking that rarely gets spoken about directly. It does not just create suffering in the moments it targets. It steals presence from every moment it doesn't. A person can be physically present for an entire decade of her own life and privately experience almost none of it, because her attention was always somewhere else, guarding against something that, more often than not, was never actually coming. This is not meant to induce guilt. Guilt is, in fact, one more version of the same pattern, another form of the mind turning against itself, another loop dressed up as self-awareness. The purpose of naming this cost is not to make anyone feel worse for having lived this way. It is to make the stakes clear enough that the coming work feels worth doing. Because unlearning old vigilance is not effortless. It asks something of a person. And people rarely commit to asking something of themselves until they understand precisely what they stand to gain. The first way this unlearning begins is through something deceptively simple, the act of naming the loop while you are still inside it. Most overthinking survives because it is invisible to the person experiencing it. It doesn't announce itself as overthinking. It disguises itself as responsibility, as thoroughness, as care. A woman preparing for a difficult conversation with her mother might spend 3 days rehearsing every possible version of that conversation, telling herself she is simply being prepared. But there is a difference between preparation and rumination, and the difference is this: preparation ends. It reaches a natural conclusion and releases its grip. Rumination has no ending. It simply loops, indefinitely, dressed as diligence. The moment a person can say, even silently, "This is the loop again," something remarkable happens. The thought loses a fraction of its authority. It stops being the truth and starts being a pattern, something happening to you rather than something that is you. This is not a magic cure. The thoughts don't vanish the instant you name them, but naming creates the smallest sliver of distance, and in psychology, that sliver is everything. It is the space in which choice becomes possible again. A woman once described this shift using an image that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said overthinking, before she learned to name it, felt like being trapped inside a house with the lights off, bumping into the same furniture over and over, convinced each collision was a new obstacle. Naming the loop, she said, was like finally finding the light switch, not because the furniture disappeared, but because she could finally see it for what it was. The same coffee table she had walked into 100 times before, not a new threat requiring a new emergency. The room did not change. Her relationship to the room did. She stopped being surprised by her own patterns, and something about that removed most of their sting. Surprise, it turns out, is a large part of what makes an old pattern feel unbearable. Familiarity, even with something painful, is far easier to carry than shock. This is worth pausing on, because so much of the exhaustion in overthinking comes not from the thought itself, but from treating each occurrence as a fresh crisis. A woman who has the same anxious spiral about being disliked for the 400th time in her life experiences it as though it were happening for the first, because no one ever taught her to recognize the shape of her own recurring patterns. Learning to notice, this is the one where I convince myself everyone secretly resents me, transforms a crisis into something closer to weather, familiar, sometimes uncomfortable, but no longer catastrophic. Here a second truth arrives, and it is one that changes everything for people who have spent years believing their thoughts and their feelings are the same thing. They are not. A thought is not proof. A feeling is not a fact. You can feel completely certain that someone is angry with you and be entirely wrong. You can feel absolutely convinced that you did something unforgivable and later discover the other person never even noticed. The mind, especially an anxious mind, is an excellent storyteller but a poor journalist. It reports with total confidence on things it cannot actually verify. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because so much suffering is built not on what actually happened, but on the story constructed around what happened. Two women can experience the exact same event, a friend canceling plans last minute, and walk away with entirely different internal experiences. One thinks, that's inconvenient, but life happens, and moves on within minutes. The other spirals into hours of analysis about what it means, whether the friendship is fading, whether she did something to cause distance. Same event, two entirely different inner worlds. The event itself was never the source of suffering. The story wrapped around it was. This does not mean the pain such stories cause is imaginary or unworthy of compassion. The suffering is entirely real, even when the story fueling it is not accurate. This distinction matters because it is easy to hear your thoughts aren't facts and mistake it for your feelings don't matter, and those are two very different messages. A woman spiraling over a cancelled plan is genuinely hurting, and that hurt deserves gentleness, not dismissal. The invitation here is not to stop feeling. It is to become curious about the story generating the feeling. To ask, quietly, is this the only possible explanation? Or is this simply the explanation my mind reaches for first, because it is the most familiar one? Often, when a person actually pauses to generate 2 or 3 alternative explanations for the same event, she's overwhelmed at work, she's dealing with something private, she genuinely just forgot. The original, most catastrophic interpretation starts to look less like an obvious truth and more like one guess among several, no more inherently valid than the others, simply louder because it arrived first. There is a second way tension takes root, and it lives not in the mind but in the body, which is something most people overlook entirely. Overthinking is not purely mental, it is physiological. When the mind spins through worst-case scenarios, the body responds as though those scenarios are actually happening. The shoulders rise toward the ears, the jaw tightens, the stomach knots, breath becomes shallow, high in the chest instead of low in the belly. And here is the cruel irony. A tense body sends signals back up to the brain that confirm danger is present, which fuels more anxious thinking, which tightens the body further. It becomes a closed loop, feeding itself indefinitely, and no amount of just calm down can interrupt a cycle that is partly physical. This closed loop explains something that confuses many people about their own anxiety. Why a stressful thought can sometimes linger in the body, long after the mind has logically moved on. A woman might resolve a conflict with a friend, understand intellectually that everything is fine, and yet still feel her stomach tight and her chest constricted hours later, as though her body did not receive the memo her mind already accepted. This is not a contradiction. It is simply evidence that thought and physiology do not always update on the same timeline. The mind can decide something is resolved in seconds. The body, especially a body that has spent years associating tension with vigilance, often needs longer and needs something more direct than reasoning, movement, breath, time, to fully release what it has been holding. Understanding this prevents a second layer of frustration that so many people add on top of the not only feeling anxious, but then feeling confused and even ashamed that the anxiety hasn't left yet, despite knowing better. The body was never obligated to move at the speed of insight. This is why so many women who consider themselves just anxious people or just overthinkers find that trying to think their way out of overthinking rarely works. You cannot out-argue a nervous system, but you can regulate it. A slow exhale, longer than the inhale, tells the body, not the mind, the body, that the danger has passed. Placing a hand over the chest and feeling it rise and fall tells an ancient part of the brain, older than language, that safety is present. These are not tricks. They are communication with a part of the self that does not understand words, only sensation. This is worth repeating in a different way because it contradicts almost everything most people have been taught about managing an anxious mind. We are told to think positive, to reframe, to talk ourselves down, all instructions aimed at the thinking mind, as though the thinking mind were the source of the storm, rather than a passenger caught inside it. But the body was often reacting before the thought ever fully formed. A tight chest can arrive before the anxious sentence does. This means that sometimes the most effective intervention is not a better thought at all, but a longer exhale, a slower step, a hand pressed flat against a cool surface. The body speaks first in this kind of storm, and it is often more honest and more reachable than the mind that follows it. There was a woman who noticed, quite by accident, that her worst anxious spirals always seemed to arrive after skipped meals, poor sleep, or too much caffeine on an already tense morning. For years, she had assumed her anxiety was purely a psychological event, something to be solved entirely through insight and self-talk. It took her a long time to notice the pattern hiding in plain sight, that her mind was far more likely to spin catastrophic stories when her body was already depleted, already running on a kind of internal static that made every thought feel louder and more urgent than it actually was. Once she began treating her body as part of the equation, eating before difficult conversations rather than after, prioritizing sleep the way she once prioritized productivity, noticing when caffeine sharpened her focus into something closer to panic, she found that entire categories of overthinking simply stopped arriving as often, not because she had solved anything psychologically that week, but because she had stopped feeding the physical conditions under which her mind reliably spiraled. The body, it turns out, is not a passive vessel carrying the mind around. It is a full participant in every thought a person has, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. There comes a moment in this kind of inner work when a woman realizes something uncomfortable. Much of her overthinking has never really been about the situation in front of her. It has been about control. Thinking feels like doing something. If you cannot control whether someone likes you, whether a job interview goes well, whether a relationship survives, then at least you can control how thoroughly you think about it. The mind offers thinking as a substitute for certainty, a way of feeling like you are managing the unmanageable. But this is where the third insight lives, quiet and often unwelcome. Certainty was never actually available, not to you, not to anyone. Every human being who has ever lived has walked forward into outcomes they could not guarantee. The peace that so many people search for is not the peace of finally knowing how things will turn out. It is the peace of being able to walk forward without knowing. This distinction changes the entire relationship a person has with their own mind. Instead of asking, how do I stop thinking about this until I feel certain, the question becomes, how do I become someone who can tolerate not being certain? That single shift, from chasing certainty to building tolerance for uncertainty, is one of the quiet, undramatic turning points that changes a life without anyone else ever noticing it happened. Think of a climber standing at the base of a mountain, hidden in fog. She cannot see the summit. She cannot see what waits 300 meters up, whether the path narrows or opens. whether the weather will hold or turn against her. A climber who refuses to move until the fog clears completely will never climb at all, because on most mountains the fog rarely clears on command. The climbers who actually reach the summit are not the ones who eliminated uncertainty before beginning. They are the ones who learned to trust their footing one step at a time, adjusting as the terrain revealed itself, rather than demanding the whole path be visible before they were willing to move. Overthinking is, in many ways, standing at the base of that mountain, refusing to take a single step because the fog has not lifted. But the fog was never going to lift on command. It was only ever going to be walked through. This is not the same as recklessness. Walking through fog does not mean abandoning care or preparation entirely. It means recognizing the difference between reasonable caution and endless rehearsal, between checking your footing once and refusing to move until every possible outcome has been mapped in advance. One is wisdom. The other is a cage built out of good intentions, and it can hold a person still for years while she waits for a clarity that was never coming. There is a particular kind of grief hidden inside chronic overthinking that rarely gets acknowledged directly. The grief of years spent waiting for permission to begin. A woman who needed to feel completely certain before leaving a relationship that no longer served her, before applying for a job she wanted, before speaking up in a meeting, before starting the creative project that had lived quietly in her mind for a decade, often discovers, looking backward, that the certainty she was waiting for never once arrived, for anyone in any of those situations. Every person who ever left, applied, spoke, or created did so without the guarantee she believed she needed first. They simply decided the discomfort of moving forward without certainty was more bearable than the slow erosion of staying still forever, waiting for a feeling that was never designed to visit before action, only sometimes after it. There was once a woman who, for most of her adult life, could not send an important email without reading it 11, 12, sometimes 20 times before pressing send. Each reading was an attempt to eliminate any possible way it could be misunderstood. She believed, without ever consciously examining the belief, that if she thought about it long enough, she could guarantee the outcome, that the recipient would respond kindly, that no misunderstanding could occur, that she would be safe from any negative reaction. It took her years to notice that no amount of rereading had ever actually prevented a negative reaction from someone who was simply having a difficult day, or misreading her tone, or projecting their own mood onto her words. The rereading never protected her. It only exhausted her. What eventually changed her was not a technique. It was a single, quiet realization. She had been trying to control other people's reactions by suffering in advance for outcomes she had no power over. The suffering was not preparation. It was a ritual that gave the illusion of control while accomplishing nothing except draining her. This brings forward the fourth way tension builds silently in the lives of so many women. The belief, often inherited rather than chosen, that being agreeable, being easy, being endlessly understanding, is the price of being loved. This belief rarely arrives as a single dramatic lesson. It arrives in 1,000 small moments. Being praised as a child for being such a good girl when she stayed quiet during conflict. Being told she was too sensitive when she expressed a need. Watching the women around her absorb frustration without complaint and calling it strength. Over time, a quiet equation forms in the mind. My needs are a burden, so I will manage them internally, silently, endlessly, rather than risk becoming inconvenient to someone else. This equation is exhausting to live inside, because it means every interaction carries a hidden tax. A simple request from a friend becomes an internal negotiation about whether saying no will damage the relationship. A disagreement with a partner becomes hours of rehearsing how to phrase disagreement so gently that it cannot possibly be perceived as conflict. The overthinking, in this case, is not really about the specific situation. It is the sound of a person trying to manage everyone else's emotional experience of her, at the cost of her own peace. It helps to understand where this equation is often first written, because it rarely begins in adulthood. It begins in small, ordinary childhood moments that seemed unremarkable at the time. A girl who cries and is told to stop making a scene learns, quietly, that her emotions are an inconvenience to others. A girl who expresses anger and is met with withdrawal or punishment, while a sibling's anger is met with patience, learns that her feelings carry a different price tag than everyone else's. None of this requires a dramatic or abusive childhood to take root. It can grow just as easily in ordinary homes, from ordinary, well-meaning adults who were simply repeating what had been modeled for them in a culture that has long rewarded quiet compliance in women and called it grace. By adulthood, the origin of the pattern is usually forgotten entirely. All that remains is the pattern itself, a reflexive shrinking, a constant internal audit of whether her presence is currently a burden, with no memory of the specific moments that built it, only the residue those moments left behind. Here is where something genuinely liberating enters the conversation. Though it can feel unsettling before it feels freeing, you were never actually responsible for managing how other people feel about you. You are responsible for your honesty, your kindness, your effort to communicate clearly. What another person does with that, whether they misunderstand it, whether they feel hurt by a boundary, whether they choose to walk away, belongs to them, not to you. This is not coldness. It is not permission to stop caring about others. It is the recognition that emotional responsibility has a boundary, and a person who has spent her life without that boundary will find, upon discovering it, that an enormous amount of her overthinking simply had nowhere left to live. This is not always easy to see from the inside, because the vigilance so often gets mistaken for virtue. She is called reliable, thoughtful, considerate, and she is those things, genuinely. But underneath the compliment often sits an unspoken exchange she never consciously agreed, to her ease for their comfort, her peace for their approval. No one hands a woman this contract directly. It accumulates, quietly, across years of small rewards for staying agreeable and small punishments, real or imagined, for taking up space. Picture two rooms. In the first room stands a woman holding not only her own emotions, but the emotions of everyone she loves, her mother's disappointment, her friend's insecurity, her partner's bad mood, carrying each one as though it were her personal responsibility to soften, fix, or prevent. The room is crowded, heavy, and she is exhausted before the day has even started, because she is carrying weight that was never hers to hold. In the second room stands a woman who has learned to set down what does not belong to her. She still cares. She still notices when someone she loves is struggling, and she still offers comfort freely. But she no longer believes that another person's inner weather is something she is required to control. The second room is not empty of love. It is only empty of unnecessary weight. Most people spend years living in the first room without ever realizing a second room exists, because no one ever told them that carrying everyone's feelings was optional in the first place. There is a story worth telling here, not because it is unusual, but because it is common enough that many listening will recognize themselves inside it. A woman had spent an entire weekend anxious about a message she needed to send her sister, by setting a boundary about a recurring pattern of last-minute cancellations that had been quietly hurting her for years. She rehearsed the message so many times that by the time she finally sent it, she had cried twice, apologized in her head a dozen times before ever saying a word, and prepared herself for a devastating reaction. Her sister read the message and replied within minutes, "You're right, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was affecting you like that." The conversation that had consumed an entire weekend of tension resolved itself in less time than it takes to make a cup of tea. This is not a rare exception. This is, more often than people expect, the actual shape of most conflicts they have been avoiding. The mind, in its attempt to protect a person from pain, frequently manufactures far more suffering than the real situation ever would have required. This leads to the fifth insight, one that quietly undoes years of anxious anticipation once it is truly understood. The imagined version of a difficult conversation is almost always worse than the real one. The mind, left unchecked, does not simply predict the future, it catastrophizes it, because a nervous system trying to protect you would rather prepare you for the worst possible outcome than be caught off guard by it. But this protective instinct comes at an enormous cost. You end up suffering through disasters. Never happen, sometimes dozens of times, while the actual moment, when it finally arrives, is almost always more survivable than anything your mind rehearsed. There is a useful, almost mathematical way to look at this pattern once you begin tracking it. If a person keeps a quiet record, even just mentally, of how many imagined disasters actually came true over the course of a year, the number is almost always startlingly small. Most people who do this exercise honestly discover that the vast majority of their most detailed, most emotionally exhausting predictions never happened at all. The friend was not upset. The job interview went fine. The difficult phone call ended in understanding rather than rupture. And yet the mind rarely updates its threat model based on this evidence, because it does not naturally keep score. It treats every new uncertain situation as a first-time event, forgetting entirely that it has cried wolf hundreds of times before and been wrong nearly every time. Keeping the score deliberately, actually noticing, out loud or on paper, how often the imagined outcome differed wildly from the real one, is one of the simplest and most underused tools for teaching an anxious mind to trust reality slightly more than it trusts its own worst predictions. There was a woman who spent nearly 2 weeks dreading a performance review at work. Certain her manager had noticed every small mistake she had made that quarter. Certain the meeting would end with some form of quiet humiliation. She rehearsed her defense in the shower, in traffic, in the moments before sleep, building an entire internal trial in which she was both the accused and her own unconvinced lawyer. When the meeting finally arrived, her manager spent most of it discussing a promotion. The mistakes she had spent 2 weeks defending herself against were never mentioned at all, because no one but her had ever considered them significant enough to remember. She walked out of that meeting, not relieved so much as disoriented, trying to reconcile 2 weeks of genuine suffering with 15 minutes of reality that bore almost no resemblance to it. This disorientation, uncomfortable as it is often the exact moment a person begins to question whether her mind's predictions deserve the authority she has always given them. There is a kind of stillness that begins to enter a person's life once she stops treating her own thoughts as prophecies. It does not happen overnight. It happens slowly, the way a forest regrows after a fire. Not all at once, but tree by tree, root by root, until one day the person notices that a situation which would have consumed her for days now only occupies an hour of her attention, and she cannot quite say when the change happened. This is important to understand, because so many people give up on inner change too early, expecting a single insight to transform them completely. Real change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, in the form of a moment where you notice you responded differently than you used to, and you almost don't notice the noticing. The sixth way tension is dissolved is through something the modern world has made increasingly rare: presence. Overthinking, by its nature, lives almost entirely in 2 places that do not exist: the past, which has already happened and cannot be changed, and the future, that which has not happened and cannot be controlled. The present moment, the only place life is actually occurring, is where overthinking cannot survive, because overthinking requires imagined scenarios, and the present moment offers none. This is why grounding techniques, feeling the texture of fabric beneath your fingers, naming 5 things you can see, noticing the temperature of the air on your skin, are not simplistic tricks for children. They are a direct interruption of the mind's habit of living anywhere except where the body actually is. When you bring your attention fully into your senses, even for 30 seconds, you are teaching your nervous system again and again that right now, in this exact moment, you are safe. And a nervous system that is repeatedly shown safety eventually begins to expect it, rather than constantly bracing against danger that is not there. It is worth being honest about how difficult this actually is at first, because presence is often described as though it were simple, and for a mind accustomed to constant movement, it is anything but. Sitting still with only the present moment can feel, in the beginning, almost unbearably uncomfortable, the way a muscle that has never been stretched resists the first attempt to lengthen it. This discomfort is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is a sign that the mind, so accustomed to the noise of planning and replaying, does not yet know what to do with quiet. Like any unfamiliar exercise, it becomes easier with repetition, not because the mind is forced into submission, but because it slowly learns that stillness does not require it to abandon its watchfulness altogether, only to set it down for a few moments at a time, long enough to remember that it is possible to set it down at all. There is a woman who once described the moment she truly understood presence, not as a concept she read about, but as something she stumbled into by accident. She was washing dishes, irritated, her mind still replaying an argument from earlier that day, rehearsing better comebacks she wished she had said, and then, without deciding to, she noticed the water, not thought about the water, noticed it, the warmth of it against her hands, the particular sound it made hitting the metal sink, the smell of the soap. For perhaps 10 seconds, the argument disappeared entirely, not because she pushed it away, but because there simply wasn't room for it, while her attention was fully occupied by something real, immediate, and physical. She said later that those 10 seconds taught her more about peace than years of trying to think her way calm ever had. The mind cannot fully inhabit an imagined argument and a sink full of warm water at the same time. Presence does not fight thought. It simply leaves thought nowhere to stand. There is a particular kind of woman who has spent her life being called strong by everyone around her, praised for how much she can carry, how calmly she handles crisis, how rarely she falls apart. What almost no one around her realizes is that this strength was often built not from peace, but from years of quiet, exhausting vigilance, a mind that never fully rests because resting once felt dangerous. The seventh insight belongs to her specifically, though it applies more broadly than she might expect. Rest is not something you earn after everything is handled. Nothing is ever fully handled. Life does not pause its uncertainty to reward you with peace. Peace has to be chosen, deliberately, in the middle of unfinished things, or it will never arrive at all, because there will always be another unfinished thing waiting, behind the one currently occupying your mind. This realization can feel almost rebellious the first time it truly lands. So much of what women are taught, both explicitly and through quiet cultural example, is that rest must be earned through exhaustion, that self-care is a reward rather than a requirement, that peace is something you deserve only once every obligation has been fulfilled. But obligations regenerate. They do not run out. A person who waits for the to-do list to be empty before allowing herself stillness will wait for the rest of her life, because the list was never designed to end. Choosing rest in the middle of an unfinished life is not laziness. It is the recognition that life itself will never hand you a finish line, so you must build small finish lines of your own, moments where you decide, on purpose, that this is enough for now. There was a woman who kept, for years, an internal ledger of everything she still needed to accomplish before she would allow herself an evening of genuine, guilt-free rest. Emails answered, house cleaned, family called, favors returned, tomorrow prepared for. The ledger was never once empty. Something always remained, because life is not the kind of project that reaches completion. It simply continues, generating new tasks the moment old ones are finished. What eventually changed for her was not the ledger. It was her belief that the ledger needed to be empty before rest was permitted. She began, instead, choosing one evening a week where she declared, regardless of what remained undone, that she was finished for the day, not because everything was handled, but because she had decided it was enough. The tasks that didn't get done that evening were, without exception, still there the next morning, waiting patiently, exactly as capable of being handled then as they would have been if she had exhausted herself completing them the night before. Nothing fell apart in her absence. The only thing that changed was that she finally had evenings that belonged to her. The eighth and final thread in this understanding is perhaps the quietest, but it holds everything else together. None of this becomes real through a single realization. It becomes real through repetition. The same way a path through a forest is not created by walking it once, but by walking it so many times that the ground itself begins to remember the shape of your footsteps. A woman who reads about these ideas once and expects her mind to be permanently changed will be disappointed, not because the ideas are wrong, but because minds do not change through information. They change through practice. The pause before reacting, the breath that lengthens the exhale, the naming of the loop, the boundary gently held even when it feels uncomfortable, the choice to rest before everything is finished. None of these are one-time decisions. They are daily returns to the same small choices, made so consistently that they eventually stop requiring conscious effort at all. The way a hand no longer has to think about how to hold a cup after years of doing it. There is a useful comparison here to anyone who has ever learned a physical skill later in life. Playing an instrument, learning a new language, training the body toward a strength it did not previously have. In every one of these pursuits, no one expects instant mastery. No one sits down at a piano for the first time and feels discouraged that their hands do not yet move fluently across the keys. There is an accepted, almost gentle patience extended toward physical or intellectual skills that is rarely extended toward emotional ones. A person who overthinks for the 400th time after only 3 weeks of trying to change, the pattern often concludes that the effort has failed, when in truth, 3 weeks is nothing against a pattern that took 20 or 30 years to build. The same patience offered so freely to a beginner pianist deserves to be offered to a mind learning for the first time how to sit in uncertainty without collapsing into it. This is, in the end, what discipline actually means. Not punishment, not rigid control, but the quiet, repeated choice to return to what you know serves you, especially on the days when your mind is loudest and most convincing in its old patterns. Discipline is not the absence of overthinking. It is the willingness to notice it, again and again, without judgment, and gently redirect yourself back toward the present, back toward the breath, back toward the truth that you are allowed to not know how things will turn out. There is no version of this work where the mind simply stops offering its old material. Even years into this kind of practice, the loop will still appear. The catastrophic text message spiral, the rehearsed conversation that never happens, the tightening in the chest before an uncertain outcome. These do not vanish permanently. The way weeds do not vanish permanently from a garden simply because you pulled them once. What changes is not the presence of the weeds. What changes is your relationship to pulling them. In the beginning, each intrusive loop feels like evidence that something is wrong with you, that you have failed at your own healing. Later, the same loop arrives and is met with something closer to familiarity than alarm. Ah, there it is again, followed by the same quiet return to breath, to boundary, to presence, without the added suffering of believing the loop should never have shown up at all. This is the quiet difference between someone who suffers from her mind and someone who has simply learned to garden it, season after season, for as long as she lives. A garden, after all, is never finished. No one who tends one expects to reach a final day when weeding is no longer required, when the soil no longer needs turning, when nothing more will ever grow that wasn't planted on purpose. The work is ongoing by nature, not because the gardener has failed, but because that is simply what living, growing things require. A mind is no different. Expecting a day when overthinking never returns at all is expecting a garden that maintains itself forever without hands in the soil. The more honest, more sustainable expectation is simpler. Not a mind that never wanders, but a woman who knows exactly how to walk it home. There is also a kind of humility required here that is rarely spoken about, because humility is not a fashionable word in conversations about self-improvement. It is the humility of accepting that healing is not linear, that some weeks will feel like enormous progress, and others will feel like a complete return to old patterns, and that neither extreme is the whole truth. A woman who judges her progress only by her best days will despair on her worst ones. A woman who has made peace with the unevenness of growth will find that even her worst days no longer undo her, because she no longer expects perfection from herself in the first place. This, too, is a form of the same lesson, repeated in a new shape, the release of certainty, this time not about the future, but about her own progress. There is a helpful way to think about this unevenness, borrowed from the shape of the tides rather than the shape of a straight line. No one watching the ocean expects the water to rise steadily, moment after moment, without ever pulling back. The tide comes in, and it also goes out, and both directions belong to the same larger rhythm of the sea meeting the shore. A person healing from years of overthinking is not moving along a straight upward path either, however much that would be easier to track. She is moving like the tide, forward, back, forward again. Each retreat not a failure of the process, but simply a part of it, exactly as the outgoing tide is not evidence that the ocean has failed to reach the shore. Given enough time, the general direction is unmistakable, even though any single day, examined too closely, might look like it is moving the wrong way entirely. There is something worth returning to now, something that was present at the very beginning of Els and has been quietly underneath everything since. The tension so many women carry is rarely a sign of weakness. It is, more often, a sign of a mind that learned to work overtime to keep itself safe, in a world that did not always make safety easy to feel. Overthinking, tension, the endless internal replaying of moments long past. These are not character flaws. They are old strategies, once necessary, now outdated, still running because no one ever showed the nervous system it was allowed to stop. There is a particular image that captures this better than any explanation could. Picture a tree that grew for years beside a fence, its trunk bending and curving around the metal to reach the light on the other side. Years later, the fence is removed entirely. The danger, if it was ever truly a danger, is gone. And yet the tree does not straighten itself out. It continues growing in the shape the fence once forced upon it. Not because the fence is still there, but because the wood has already hardened into that curve. And wood does not unbend simply because the obstacle has been taken away. This is what old patterns of overthinking often look like in a grown woman's life. Not evidence of a present danger, but the shape her mind bent into around a danger that existed once, long ago, and has since been removed. The work is not to blame the tree for its curve. It is to understand, gently, that growth is still possible from here. New wood forming straighter than the old, even if the original bend never fully disappears. But it is allowed to stop. Not all at once, and not perfectly, but slowly, the way any long winter eventually gives way to something warmer, not because winter is forced to end, but because the earth, underneath all that frozen stillness, was quietly preparing for spring the entire time. And perhaps that is the truest thing to understand. Long after every technique has been tried and every insight has been absorbed, you were never broken for thinking so much. You were simply a person who cared deeply, in a world that rarely teaches people what to do with that much care. The vigilance, the rehearsing, the sleepless replaying of ordinary moments. These were never signs of weakness. They were the fingerprints of a mind that learned, long ago, to love and to fear in the same breath, and simply never unlearned how to separate the two. Somewhere, tonight, there is a version of you lying awake, replaying something small until it feels enormous. Let her know, gently, that she is allowed to put it down. The stillness you are looking for was never on the other side of certainty. It was always waiting quietly on this side of acceptance, and the moment you stop fighting your own mind and start walking beside it instead, you will find that the silence you were searching for was never far away. It was simply waiting for you to stop running loud enough to hear it.